This is Newark, New Jersey. We are seeing the sights and hearing the sounds of a revolution.
In July 1967, white officers stopped a black cab driver in Newark, New Jersey. Rumors quickly spread that he was beaten to death by the police. A revolt in the city's poorest neighborhoods escalated into 6 days of rioting.
I got beat. I thought I was going to get killed.
The riots seem to me to be an understandable rebellion against racism, against police brutality.
I'm Natasha Del Toro. Tonight on America Reframed, we go back to those 6 days in Newark to hear from activists, policemen, politicians, and citizens who were there. What happened and what they learned. Revolution 67.
Major funding for America Reframed on World is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding is provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation.
This is not Saigon, nor is this a battle in which Americans are defending our country from an invasion by a foreign power. This is Newark, New Jersey, population 400,000. And we are seeing the sights and hearing the sounds of a revolution.
So Newark was a hotbed for change.
American cities were in crisis situations.
I mean, I got beat. I thought I was going to get killed, actually.
The riots at the time seemed to me to be a rebellion, an understandable rebellion against racism, against police brutality.
We haven't owned up to what happened to our cities.
We knew about Watts, we knew about, I can't remember who came first, but so there was always that sense of what's going to happen here.
Bad housing, bad services.
And then all of a sudden you got riots and fear. It's no wonder that people decide, we're out of here.
And so we lived through a terrible time. 26 people altogether.
I don't know if Newark has fully recovered from it.
No, don't tell me about history unless you tell the truth.
But probably the bigger truth is that Newark is a city.
I mean, I don't condone riots.
That's been victimized like so many other cities.
As wild a joint as America is, have to know what happened.
For 3 years, America has had to face the tragic consequences of riots stemming from the slums of cities stretching right across the nation.
It was a long, hot, riotous summer. In Newark, in Detroit, and in other major cities, civil rights protests blossomed into full-fledged riots that bordered on anarchy.
To those in Newark, the warnings of the impending disaster were sounded often for many years. This is the story of Newark, but it has been the story of riots in many cities. It may have come to your city already. And if the lessons of Newark aren't learned, your city can be next.
On July the 12th of 1967, a ordinary traffic infraction was committed by a cab driver.
A person with a classic name, the kind of name that slaves were given, John Smith.
John Smith was pulled over by 2 Italian-American Newark cops.
He says he went around a police car that was double parked. The police version was that he kind of swerved around them recklessly and went down a wrong way on a one-way street.
He was beaten by the cops in the squad car. He was taken to the old 4th Precinct in Newark.
Here you have a large public housing project across the street. And now you have white policemen who seem to be beating up this guy as they're taking him in to the police station. The police said he resisted arrest.
A rumor spread around the Central Ward that not only had he been beaten, but he had died.
And everybody ran to that precinct saying, what happened? They wanted to break into a police headquarters and see if the rumors were true.
a group of black leaders was allowed to meet with John Smith.
And they took him to the hospital. Indeed, he did need medical attention.
But the rumor still stuck. A group of blacks surrounded or came in front of the old 4th Precinct.
People getting on top of cars and say they were going to go downtown and riot. And we stood there and say, if you do that, you're going to end up being killed. If you do that, you're going to get shot. Don't do that.
Bob Kervin, head of corps at that time, was standing on flatbed trucks in front of the precinct saying, calm down, we'll go in, we'll be your emissaries to go in and try to find out what happened.
People started throwing bottles at the 4th Precinct.
I don't know where it came from, but somebody threw a Molotov cocktail.
Which is a bottle of gasoline with a rag that if you light it and then throw it against something, it will explode. So it's kind of a scary thing.
Of course, I split. Everybody on the street just got out of there. They thought, this is going to be the end of the world.
The police came out of the precinct and began to quell the crowd, and the riots started there.
But you have a very, very volatile situation on the evening of July 12th.
There was looting along Springfield Avenue.
But by 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, things had quieted down. And it looked like, well, it was kind of an active night, but it's going to all go by. In a sense, the trigger was an event that could have been any event. It was this one. Under normal circumstances, it probably would not have. I mean, because the same thing had happened, no doubt, thousands of times in American history without incident. But this particular time, something happened.
It spread, and we tried to decide, well, what are we going to do? We're obviously not going to leave town. We chose the role, including myself, chose the role of being witnesses.
Do we have a staff of organizers who...
Tom Hayden, an activist in Newark, came to our city trying to find the social fibers to improve the community.
At the time, it was normal in the South for white people to do civil rights work and voter registration work in black areas. The Mississippi Freedom Project, where the 3 young men were shot, was a challenge to which way the Democratic Party and the country was going to go, towards solving civil rights and poverty or towards escalating a war in a place we'd never heard of. Well, when we decided to do this in 1964, we left Students for a Democratic Society.
I literally left my graduation, much to my father's chagrin, and went off to the ERAP training.
So I was part of a very heady, utopian band of young activists. We saw our mission as trying to do community organizing in the poorest areas and the forgotten areas of the United States. And the idea was it was time to tackle northern cities. And we literally divided ourselves up and gave ourselves to different cities. I didn't know Newark from any other cities. It just fit the profile of a big city with huge poverty and racial problems. Well, the idea was to create a movement that had the political power sufficient to turn our priorities around. The country had to deal with poverty the way that Roosevelt dealt with poverty. You had to have public works projects, rebuild communities, put people to work. We started living in apartments among the poor.
My father particularly was very upset. My father thought I was a dupe of the communists. To have me move back to a slum, he couldn't understand it.
But there was always the mystery. What are those people doing here? It was as if the people who lived and were raised in Newark felt anyone in their right mind who could get out of here would get out. So anybody that would move to Newark intentionally had to be a communist or a really dangerous and conspiratorial person. A lot of adults and newspaper reporters and police always wondered, how'd you do that? How was it funded? We raised money from our adult friends, our parents.
Everything was collective. Whoever had money got money, borrowed money.
Meals consisted of self-cooked rice and beans.
Bologna sandwiches and peanut butter and jelly. And
we never went out. We never went to movies. The cost of a subway to New York, that was about it. We were in our 20s. I think it's the way people in their teens and 20s still live today. They put up with voluntary poverty until they flip and they seem to need bourgeois comfort.
Let's join this fight for freedom.
The most important thing was to empower a new force in local politics. They triggered an amazing overreaction from the politicians.
Many youth movements, or most youth movements, are idealistic in nature, and I think this program is one of the idealistic movements. But I think they came here with the wrong approach. I think they came here with a hostile attitude.
You know, we really were considered outside, I mean, all those funny terms that people use, outside agitators, anti-police, communists, troublemakers.
My whole life has been spent trying to figure out, I mean, how stinking the political system is.
The label outside agitator really fit. It really fit. On the other hand, there was no one agitating from the inside.
Tom, when they came to Newark, considered themselves anarchists or revolutionaries. They came to Newark because of the activities organized by the black activists in Newark.
If they're going to achieve their goals as far as civil rights is concerned, that they must be involved in the political process of our county.
In Cup, they were college kids, they were intellectuals, and were not at all interested in politics. Their manifesto was about overturning the democratic system in America. And they were going to start in Newark.
I don't want to say that Tom Hayden or any of the other individuals that you had just mentioned are the ones that spurred the Newark riot. We do believe, at least I believe, that there was a certain amount of outsiders that came in and then in turn provided direction to what unfolded.
Newark, New Jersey became a city of race riots, violence.
The first night, as I recall, was primarily targeted looting. Black-owned businesses, as I recall, were not looted. I remember hearing people talk about having gotten back, in a sense of vengeance, against particular store owners, and they would name them by name and complain about specific things that we knew about, that this guy was always trying to gyp you, that the scales were rigged at the store.
There was a store on Clinton Avenue that was called Your Southern Store up north. A guy who worked at the store, a local guy, said that they were cheating on the cash register, and he showed us how they could, like if you put $5 on the top of the aiding machine, registered it, then tore it off on the paper, then put a 0, and then they would be this long, because it'd be a lot of, long list. At the total at the end would have the $5 in it. And it would look to anybody would assume the 0 meant it was a clean machine.
So even among the looters, there was this justice based on retribution, and that you could therefore predict what might happen if the police did this or the police did that. Unfortunately, the state and the police viewed the mob in the conventional sense, the stereotype sense, and so they acted in ways that inflamed the situation even more. The community had a certain amount of twisted delight in what had happened.
It was just very strange. It was a little bit like a party. There was a lot of energy. People were talking and hanging out on the street. And so I was out on the street. I was not looting. And I had my favorite orange raincoat in the cleaners down the street. But at some point they broke into the cleaners and people were running by with clothes. And I was saying, wait a minute, I want to see if you have my raincoat. And I can't remember. I don't think I found my raincoat.
You mean a party atmosphere?
That's exactly it. That's just the way it looked to me. There were people who were stealing out of the cleaners. They weren't even using the thing, just throwing them on the street.
Well, the next day, Mayor Hugh Addonizio did have a meeting with, again, civil rights leaders. And in fact, he agreed to a series of demands to promote a black lieutenant to captain, to suspend the policemen who were the arresting officers, to a couple of other demands. And they gave in to that. And he is alleged to have said to reporters, well, a few broken bottles and some broken glass, it happens and it's more or less over. There were a number of activists in the neighborhood who were calling for a mass meeting on the night of July the 13th. And this one did not end so well.
We organized a demonstration the next night. Did we intend to have a riot? No. And people were mad, and we were going to be part of trying to organize and focus that anger. And we were mad too.
When I got home, suddenly little boys came around and said they're breaking out windows on Springfield Avenue. And so, you know, I got my brand new Volkswagen bus and went out, you know, actually to investigate. We took a guy to the hospital who had been shot. But mostly we were riding around looking at what the police were doing. So finally, 2 o'clock in the morning, the bus got stopped. A bunch of policemen, they pulled us out of the car and they proceeded to beat us up. They claimed they were on me. They claimed guns fell out of, you know, the dashiki I was wearing. Ironically, the guy who started was a guy I went to high school with. Because that's the first thing I said. Hey, I know you. We went to high school. He hit me with the front end of his gun right in my head. Pew! It just sprouted all over. And I got beat. I thought I was going to get killed, actually. But the people in the windows started throwing stuff. First, it was brought to police headquarters. They kicked me in the, you know, genitals. They brought me into Spina's office, threw me on the floor, and they said, and Spina said, "They got you." I mean, it was like a movie, you know. So I said, "Yeah, but I'm not dead."
The riots can be seen as a police riot. It can be seen as a breakdown of law and order. It can be seen as the last gasp of a declining city. But one construction is the riot as a fratricidal war between black and white neighbors.
At the hospital, no, the guy, the so-called doctor, said, "You're the poet." I said, "Yes." He said, "You'll never write any more poetry." And then he proceeded to sew up my head with no, you know, what do you call it, painkiller, whatever that was. You know, he sewed it up. You know, it was one of those scenes. I mean, it was war.
But there's still hours left in the evening, and the situation on the streets of Newark is indeed out of control. There's looting and there are fires going on. It's important to remember, though, that hardly anybody's been killed at this point. Mayor Hugh Adonisio, who earlier had sort of blown off the riot, is saying that essentially all is lost. He puts in a call to Governor Richard Hughes in Trenton, who agrees to call it the National Guard.
There was a good deal of bigoted stereotyping of young black people. It was as if they were already a mob. Even when they were peaceful and apathetic, they were a mob in the making. So when they actually became a mob, I could imagine that from the police standpoint, only crushing force could stop them. The history of crowds and riots and revolutions is never really told from the ground up. You always think they're the explosions of madness.
Many Americans are likely to think, oh yeah, that's just what black people do. Oh yeah, that's just part of city problems. But when you step back, you see that when such riots or upheavals or disturbances occur, it's people pushed to the edge. So, for instance, if you're reading French history or German history or English history, this same kind of disturbances are saying, ho, 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 big problems.
The making of Newark's riot actually begins a full generation before the riots actually hit.
You know, I think we often mistakenly believe that it's natural that the inner cities be problematic and the suburbs be pristine in the United States, but it wasn't really so much God or nature that decided that. It's human decisions.
Mainly through federal housing, transportation policy, Newark was destined to become a city mainly of poor people, mainly of black people, where more and more upwardly mobile whites would be encouraged to actually leave the city.
After World War II, and certainly throughout the 50s, the whole image of the suburbs was pushed. You haven't arrived until you get to the suburbs, until you have your backyard, until you have your front yard, and maybe 2 cars. You know, suburban tracts were subsidized by the federal government, you know, and the highways were subsidized by the federal government.
1945 until really into the 70s, the suburbs were white territory, thanks to government action. It was not just white flight. It was also white people taking advantage who wouldn't of very advantageous lending policies. These things had not been available before the war to a wide segment of Americans. They were not available to black people.
You had the bank redlining under Roosevelt. Actually created maps where they literally drew red lines around a block with the presence of just one black person or one Jewish person would be enough to literally redline a block on the map, which meant there would be no mortgages given on those blocks.
Newark is written off by the people who are making these decisions. So they're really saying that Newark is not a good place for the federal government to invest. The suburbs are.
Block busting. Real estate developers busted up blocks because one black family might move in, scare tactics to get whites to sell cheap and then sell high to the blacks who moved in. The pitch was, hey, these colored people are moving in. You better sell now before your house value goes all the way down. And you get these people just to get scared. They'd sell their house low. But then those blacks who moved in weren't getting any bank loans. They wouldn't get any insurance on those homes. So that led to conditions which deterioration of much of the wood stick housing that Newark had. So it was, disgusting but fascinating from an economic point of view. When I grew up in the 50s, I can recall in my neighborhood, there were always places where people can get pretty decent jobs and establish yourself, have some kind of stability economically. Throughout the 50s, many of these companies, they moved to southern New Jersey or southern United States until finally, we're at the point where, companies just, global monopoly capitalism just will take it wherever, they can make the most money.
So here are a bunch of black folks up here looking for jobs in the industrial sector. Suddenly they got here, and there was nothing here. It was like an old bait-and-switch routine.
All of those led to conditions that resulted in, poor housing and poor health care and less job opportunities, which were why people felt disenfranchised, they were destabilized economically, and all of those things were what led to Newark in 67, or Detroit in 67, or Watts.
By morning of July 14th, the state police are rolling into the city. And by noon, the New Jersey National Guard is arriving. Then you have the second part of the riot, which is the looting has pretty much stopped, but the killing has just begun.
We had chaos in Newark. Every store on Springfield Avenue was either looted or exposed. Governor Hughes went out in his car, toured the area. It was very dangerous, but he did it. And he would stop and arrest people.
I witnessed one arrest of a man and a woman apparently prosperous in no less than a Cadillac car, apparently a new one, just caught in the act of robbing a shoe store of several shoes. If I had my way about court scheduling, that would be the first case tried.
Police in Newark at the time, I don't think were up to dealing with the whole problem.
We certainly were not prepared to deal with it. And you felt it because you felt like, nobody prepared us for this. We didn't talk about this in the police academy. We haven't talked about this kind of a thing. This is urban warfare here. But you have to understand that, again, police officers did not get up that morning with a plan to go out and start a riot. Our actions of two officers may have triggered those riots. But you can't hold the police department accountable for years of neglect.
It wasn't the state troopers that beat up John Smith. It wasn't the state troopers or National Guard that created the climate of fear of police in the black community.
What I did witness was something that I just couldn't comprehend immediately. And that was burned out stores, shattered windows. It looked like a war zone, and it took me by surprise. We were not there to arrest. We were not there to subdue. Our mission was to go in there with the assigned task of helping the state police and the Newark police control the riot that had broken out there.
There were tanks on our street.
Then the heavy police, army presence started to appear. And then it got more scary because then there started to be more violence.
Seeing the National Guardsmen standing outside, I kept thinking of those old monster movies from the 50s, like The Day the Earth Stood Still.
We have come to visit you in peace.
Encounter with the National Guards where they stuck me with a bayonet and a rifle saying, can't go here, you can't go there, you can't do this, you can't do that. My whole freedom was tested because our neighborhood was surrounded by the National Guards. Barbed wire was put up to keep us from going to certain areas.
Barbed wire was principally utilized in and around the checkpoints. Therefore, it caused the cars that were coming down into Newark to be funneled to this one narrow opening. They would halt everybody. They would check the individual's driver's license because if indeed the individual was a resident of Newark, then he would be considered for entry.
We're being stopped on the streets. You know, we're being always law-abiding, but now we were considered to be possible lawbreakers. Not because we broke the law, it was because the color of our skin.
You really have three forces. You have the regular Newark police, you have the New Jersey State Police, and then you have the New Jersey National Guard. They don't communicate with each other.
Our own communication was like a mess. So even with that, it was just chaos. It was total chaos. It's the only way I can describe it. Both from our inability to respond to it, as well as our communication setup, you name it. In every respect, it was complete chaos.
So talk about a situation where you've got a tragedy waiting to happen. It's three military forces chasing after some imaginary people, and they're not talking to each other, and they're all scared. But meanwhile, they've all got weapons with live ammunition in them. My father was in the National Guard. I want to say nothing against the National Guard, but these are weekend warriors.
We are classified as weekend warriors because we had at that particular time drilled one weekend per month. And we also went away for a summer camp that basically consisted of 2 weeks active duty at some location. We were not skilled in any training pertaining to riot control.
And I would hear shooting at night, but I never saw I wasn't going out to look to see who was shooting who, and certainly there were soldiers with guns on the streets.
The National Guard. I was in jail and looked out the bars and saw them shoot two people coming around the corner going up New Street, the National Guard.
Many whites, particularly white men, had come to view black men as inherently dangerous, likely to be armed, and likely to be intent on taking the life of a white.
This is the newspaper headline, and what you see is that the riots increase as Negro sniping widens. So what we're learning here is that the African Americans, the blacks, the Negroes as they're called in, are the ones who are causing the mayhem. Well, there's no question that was the group that was doing the initial rioting. But I think that one of the things we have learned from history is that the way it's reported and the way it actually happened are sometimes not in neat convergence. And this is one of those cases where the public was led to believe that the main violence was caused by black people, especially young men with guns, when in fact the violence was mostly the result of the state police and the National Guard.
There was a great deal of aimless violence directed at blacks, where National Guardsmen would just shoot up in the projects expecting that there would be snipers. Now, keep in mind that over the course of the 1960s, sniping had become a stereotype, oftentimes used by the police to characterize blacks. In other words, blacks would be snipers. Some of this, quite frankly, has to do with the Vietnam War. This was a very violent period in which certain words were oftentimes used almost as a blanket to explain to attempt to explain the behavior of black men, of Vietnamese people. I mean, there were all kinds of, there was great tension in this period. So when the National Guard came to Newark, they pretty much were intent on treating Newark as a battleground.
Sniper fire from open windows kills 2 policemen, a fire captain shot in the back while answering a false alarm, and several bystanders. Scores of police, troopers, guardsmen, and civilians are wounded. Officials said the snipers, some believed not to be Newark residents, used guns stolen from a local rifle factory. Even machine guns were used.
You hear a gunshot, you turn around, and your instinct is to fire back. Whether you hit somebody facing you, somebody facing the other way, running away, that's just the way it goes.
And so what happened, tragically many times, is that the state police of the National Guard literally opened up on housing projects so that, a grandmother in a public housing project, sticks her head up to pull her 2-year-old granddaughter down and is shot, through the neck.
When people emphasizing my mother being killed in the riots and she had so many children, and there was other people killed too. There were little children killed. There was grandmothers killed, grandfathers, little boys. A little boy went to go take out his garbage. Come on, it was so many people. And I say to myself when I'm at home, I say, where are these people?
24 of those 26 people that are on the memorial marker were African American. And all of those people were killed by the police or by the National Guard or the state police.
Well, what we know, again, in retrospect, is that the state police and the National Guard fired more than 13,000 rounds of ammunition. Fewer than 100 rounds are even alleged to have been fired by the so-called perpetrators of this. So that's 150 shots on this side versus every one on this side. And we're not even sure about the one on this side. We know how many were shot here because they had to account for their bullets.
I had to account for the shells missing from my .45.
Quite frankly, the state police, and this is not a knock on them, it's a knock on it, or the National Guard, they didn't work here on a regular basis. They did not know the neighborhood. They did not know people in the neighborhood like we did. We have personal relationships. And these fellows would come in from God knows where, from South Jersey, from Pennsylvania, who lived anywhere. They would come here, and they would just fire their guns indiscriminately, and then, of course, they were going to be gone, once this thing was put down, and they left.
What was found after the fact was a woman was killed in a 5th or 6th floor apartment in what was a barrage of firing by National Guardsmen and state police. When someone shouted or someone said, and they trained the guns on that roof and began firing. Not just began firing at that in the direction of that roof. And she was killed. When the Hughes Commission, which was a state commission, went and looked at this situation afterwards, they found that all the bullets in there, there was no sniper. All the bullets that killed her were state trooper or National Guard.
Do I believe that there were snipers? Yes. As we were rolling down Orange Avenue, suddenly fire broke out. The shells were coming right over our heads, anywhere from 10 to 15 feet. Therefore, because of the tracers, it more or less like was a fire coming from maybe another National Guard unit. In every clip, like every 5th or 10th round, has a tracer in it, so you know where your firing was going, particularly at night. We pulled the trucks over to the side of the road. We asked all the men to dismount and take cover. I went up on the left side, but as I'm approaching this hill, what I did notice were 2 African Americans beating the hell out of each other. So what I did was pull my .45 caliber pistol from my holster, and I fired it straight into the air. They immediately disappeared from the scene. When I fired those pistol shots, there was an individual deep within a vacant bank who must have thought that I was firing at him. He had an automatic weapon in his hand, and what he did was fire at me. When you fire a semi-automatic weapon for an M1, and that's the type of rifle I was carrying, an M1 Garand rifle, you'd hear pow, 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 pow. But with an automatic weapon, it's pow, 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 and you know the difference when you're being fired on by an automatic weapon. The National Guard units that for the most part came into Newark were not carrying automatic weapons. This was an automatic weapon that had been fired. Not aware of any of the state police that we were associated with, not aware of any of the local police that we were associated with. carrying an automatic weapon.
I recall Life magazine. You used to get that every week, and of course they had that one story about the snipers.
You see the black hands on the rifle.
The flick that they had in Life magazine of the so-called, that was a studio portrait.
I interviewed everybody. I tried to interview the lawyers, the Life magazine writers. Who is the sniper? And I spent thousands of hours on this and could find nothing.
Later on, of course, not one person was ever arrested as a sniper.
The irony here is I was born and raised in Newark in the early part of my life. And here I am coming home from Germany after facing the East German, after facing the Russian. I hadn't fired a shot and not hadn't spoken a word of anger. And finding myself in my own neighborhood being shot at by my neighbors.
I thought of it as a myth, an urban legend. Politically, the fear of the sniper serves a very powerful, galvanizing, unifying purpose for the politics of law and order without any space for the politics of justice.
Newark was really, if you will, not intentionally working on a fratricidal war, but was moving in that direction because of what was happening in the city, where you have more and more blacks coming into the city, unable to mimic the experience or the trajectory of the white immigrant. All immigrant and migrant groups do pretty much the same thing. You'll come into the city, they'll start businesses, they will either carve out their own space or be forced into a space, and they begin the long climb up the American ladder of success. Blacks sought to do the same thing that the Italians and the Poles and the Hungarians and the East European Jews did.
Make a mistake to try to superimpose the immigrant paradigm on blacks. It's just a mistake. It's a different history. It's a whole different set of circumstances. And the big difference is the race of the matter. We live in a racialized society. I didn't say racist, I said racialized, okay? We live in a racialized society. Race is a factor. So, the experience of an Italian immigrant when standing over there is just another white person is different from a black person standing over there. The perception is different. It just is. And it's rooted in our history. It's rooted in slavery.
Once people were free, they could move to better their situation. The post-slavery era, we got hundreds of thousands of people coming into places like Newark looking for good jobs.
In the 19th and 20th century, Newark became one of the 2, 3, or 4 most important industrial cities in all of America. Newark was a prosperous town in that it had silk stocking districts where the rich lived. But the obvious thing was, in an industrial city, the bulk of the people were on the bottom of the scale. Hard work, long hours, little pay, no benefits. You worked very hard, you died young, you were replaced, your children took over, and the cycle started again. These factories were eating up people. They had to have bodies running their plans. You look at drawings of Newark in the 19th century, and there's no such thing as planning. There's a factory, there's a warehouse, and all around them are cheap, expensive houses. Many of the African Americans that came here lived in the same houses that the pre-Europeans had lived in 25, 30, 50, 75, 100 years ago. So the crappy houses that were built for the Europeans were inherited by the blacks. The African Americans, they were just older and in worse shape.
And then racial discrimination crammed them into poor housing because discrimination stopped them from being able to buy into new areas.
One of the major causes for the riots is poor housing. which has been habitual. This led in the 1940s and 50s to building housing projects. This led to the mistake of overbuilding housing projects.
Just before the riots, what used to be a vibrant but poor black community had become a walled-in black community of these high-rise housing projects in which there was a great deal of alienation.
All these high-rise dungeons that circled the core of this city. In a very small spot, there was over 5,000 public housing units.
Building an awful lot of public housing so that you concentrate the poor at the center of Newark and not in Milburn and not in Saddle River and not in Morris, not in Wayne and not in Metuchen, not in these other places, but in Newark, so you'll have the poorest people.
The federal government played a role in creating what we are still recovering from, and that is a racially balkanized metropolitan area.
So Newark becomes sort of an incubator. Problem stacked on top of problem.
People just stacked in there without the kind of services that they really need. In many cases, they became breeding grounds for crime.
If you stopped and think about it, if you stacked up anybody, anything that tight, that high, poor, hallways too small, elevators that didn't work, management that was non-existent. We knew early on that form affected behavior, so it wasn't about who it was. If you stack these folks up anywhere in this country, you're going to have these same problems.
This demonizing of high-rise housing, at least for lower-income people, is pretty ridiculous. When they first built housing projects, they worked. And they were mainly lower-income people. The difference was that there's management, the commitment to managing these buildings properly. If you do put a lot of poor people into one place like those housing projects, then it could still work, but you better be damn sure that your management works. Here in Newark, what happened was that the housing authority just kept taking the money and ran. There was no reason why those housing units couldn't have worked. They worked before. They work with moderate income people, middle income people. There's no reason in the world why it shouldn't have worked with lower income people.
I got drafted in the big buildup for Vietnam and expected to go to Vietnam, and it was just the luck of the draw. I got sent to Korea. And so I'm sitting in the sergeant's quarters in the barracks leafing through this Life magazine, and what struck me initially, of course, was the cover of this 12-year-old boy who was lying in the street, looked like he was dead. Blood had pooled beneath the body and that sort of thing. And I began to look at the article inside about the riots. As I got to a particular page, there I see a photo of a friend of mine, Billy Furr. It's shocking to see a friend in the magazine anyway. And he's looting apparently a case of beer from a liquor store.
I was hired by Life magazine in the summer of 1967, and I was temporary, because their regular photographers were, on vacation. And when the riots broke out, they sent me over to Newark. And I came over with a writer named Dale Whitner. And so we had our little white shirts and ties, and we're all clean-shaven, and we're going around, nothing happening, just nothing happening. It all happened already, Billy Furr and his friends were walking by, and they were going into a store that already had been looted. Dale had been talking to them, and we were very hot, and they said, "You want us to bring us a couple of, cool ones for you?" And Dale looked at me and said, "Sure." It's like, we thought nothing of it. And so they went in there, and they stole, the soda pop or beer, whatever it was. Can't remember, but they came out and they were about to hand it to us. And these police came out of the police came out of nowhere.
I was in the barracks by myself, just stunned, looking at this magazine. It turns out that this is a sequence of photos. And in the next couple of photos, you see that a police car has pulled up to the curb. A couple of cops have gotten out. One has a shotgun. He's wearing a yellow hard hat, like a construction hat, and takes aim at my friend and shoots him.
They shot him, and in the shotgun spray, the little kid, Joey Best Jr. Wound up shot, but he didn't die. Billy Ford did die, though. And he died right in front of me. It was just, I just couldn't believe that they didn't shoot at his legs or something. Why kill the guy, the poor guy,
Unfortunately, the killing began. I found myself interviewing victims' families and trying to reconstruct the stories. What I found in all the cases was an innocent victim or a person whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time or stealing a six-pack of beer. Some were shot in the back. But the interesting thing was the reaction to terror and intimidation was anger. And instead of law and order suppressing people, they provoked people into acts of foolish bravery. I mean, walking right in front of police with bayonets. These kids knew already what punishment was. Punishment was the solution to every problem in their lives. Being beat up by police, frisked by police, framed by police, beaten in jail. What I didn't understand was why the police didn't understand that the punishment only made for more resistance, that it did not break the will or break the spirit or make these young people law-abiding citizens who wanted to be white suburbanites. But that was the philosophy. Teach them a lesson, punish them.
I argue that it's not surprising that Newark had a riot. Rather, it's surprising that Newark had not had an earlier riot.
Ironically, the day before the riots, I was entertaining the then district attorney from Baltimore. And as we were going through Newark, he said to me, "How come you haven't had a riot in this town?" And we had a grand jury investigation in which they said there was a pervasive feeling of corruption in the city of Newark. Newark has always had that reputation. I remember as a kid, my father referring to the city hall as the Steelworks.
What does that mean?
That there was nobody honest really in the city.
Why do I have to be afraid?
The 20th century dealt two blows to the city which were very, very substantial. One was the Great Depression of 1929, which affected Newark, I think, more than most American cities because Newark was a manufacturing city. Hundreds of factories and tens of thousands of people thrown out of work permanently. The 20th century brought another staggering blow to Newark, and that was Prohibition. And Prohibition was particularly bad in that it helped in the rise of organized crime. Organized crime became almost a fact of life in many American cities, Chicago, Detroit, Newark, big tough cities. The idea that it's smart to break the law became almost a fact of life.
Shrouding Newark, increasingly after World War II, was the perception and the reality of corruption. City halls seemed to be available to the highest bidder.
People would say, well, we applied for a permit, and we were told, in effect, that was something you bought. There was organized crime in Newark, and the feeling was that the Newark Police Department not only wasn't doing much about that, but they resented what we were doing in the prosecutor's office. We were actually investigating parts of the police department, but the police department was checking on us at the same time we were checking on them.
The government reported that Agnizio gave 1% of the city's budget to the mob. But it was corrupt in that sense of making deals with the various kinds of contractors. It's like taking the resources of the city, of the citizens, and sending it to the mob or sending it to singular corrupt elements that might not even have to do with the mob.
After his tenure of service as mayor, Mayor Agnizio, for years of misbehavior as the chief executive officer of the city, he was indicted and was imprisoned.
But what it showed me is even after Agnizio was busted, and I would say throughout the Gibson regime, and to a certain extent even today, that there's still mob ties there's still tribute given to those folks.
As late as 1996, the commissioner of police is himself indicted for corruption. There are those who would say that, well, it's endemic, but it's not endemic. New York City is 20 times bigger than Newark, or 30 times, so you don't have mayors of New York City getting indicted or police commissioners going to jail. It's possible not to have corruption in great cities.
After the Second World War, the fact that blacks were increasingly becoming the majority population really posed a cultural, political, maybe even a spiritual threat to whites. And I think the group that knew that most of all was the Newark Police Force.
When you're living in what we call then a police city, where the police can harm you, stop you, shoot you. How many times where he was reaching for a wallet, he was shot? We were always fearful that our lives could be snatched away in a second by the police. After all, they had the weapons, not us. A place that the majority of people felt powerless, felt like they had been abused, felt like they didn't have a voice.
What had to do with the riots was the climate that existed in Newark. The administration in Newark wasn't really as concerned as it should be with people who were unfortunate or deprived, who didn't have the opportunities in Newark that the democratic system should have offered them.
And racism, in many ways, used the levers of city government to promote the interests of certain ethnic groups over the interests of others. One of the ways you'd address that was the anti-poverty program.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
The way things used to be was the money went to the city, and the city to the, down the line. Well, the War on Poverty said, hold it. That's not working. We think the problem's with you guys here in City Hall, that you get the money and then it doesn't get to where the problems are. So we're going to bypass you. And, of course, they were resentful. Of course.
I wouldn't have liked it either if I were them.
Why?
Because
Why?
It took away their control of jobs and patronage and things that the mayor generally controls.
Antagonism between anti-poverty programs and city government, it grew out of pure self-interest. No politician wanted to see Washington, D.C. funding his potential rivals. Didn't want to see. What kind of sense did that make to him? Yeah, money got stolen in the anti-poverty program. But you don't use that to condemn an entire approach. Are you suggesting we don't have corruption in the suburbs? Are you suggesting that suburban subdivision developers don't pay off zoning people? Are you suggesting that? Nobody's going to suggest that. The anti-poverty program had a much wider impact than stolen money, much wider. Did things in housing, did things in job creation. It hired secretaries, trained paraprofessionals, who eventually went on to other jobs. Yeah, City Hall couldn't do that, or wouldn't do it. Couldn't or wouldn't. You pick. You take your choice.
Model Cities program recognizes that our cities are made of people and not just brick and mortar.
Model Cities program's money went straight from HUD to the city administration. And that killed the anti-poverty program eventually.
Politicians did not like the empowerment of the poor. They wanted all services to go through them and people to remain dependent.
They don't want poor people for the first time since 1776 to have the right to fight City Hall.
We wanted the powerless to have a voice and to control services neighborhood by neighborhood. So somebody came up with a theory called building community unions. And all of our projects would have that in the name. It would be the Newark Community Union Project. It became known as NCUP.
It was just a few students at first, and then they grew. And this is how they developed this organization to organize people to make changes.
Here's what we did. We would go out every morning and knock on doors and keep lists, and we'd go 3-4 blocks on the same street and then try to invite the people who were willing to come to a meeting.
What do people in this neighborhood want to change? And I'd really like to hear from about the 6 women that are sitting there. What was the question? The question is, what do you want to change? What do you want to change? What is there about this neighborhood that you want to change and that you think you can if we get enough people together?
Even now when I come back, I look at the streets from the point of view of knocking on doors. Like this street we're going down is excellent. Take a look. You just look down. See all those porches right in a row? You could just make your way down in the morning, see everybody. If they wanted you to come back at dinner when Daddy was home, you'd come back at dinner. The first door I knocked on, I think it was at 61 Jelliff. A little girl came to the door. I gave her my usual rap. Hi, my name is Tom. I'm knocking on doors in the neighborhood today. I'm here to help organize an organization that will do something about the problems in this community, and could I speak to your parents if they're here? She goes away, just staring at me. She doesn't say yes or no. And about 3 minutes later, her mother, who was probably about 40 years old, very beautiful, she came to the door, and she told me what her daughter had said to her when the daughter came back to the bedroom to announce my arrival. The little girl came to her mother and said, "Mommy, there's a beetle at the door."
I think it meant something to them that white people were doing it.
Many of us, myself included, didn't really think of how bad it was for many people. You know, it was kind of individual. You know, if you were doing kind of okay, you kind of did what you had to do. And the other suffering that people were having seemed like that was what it was supposed to be.
These were the people that Martin Luther King talked about, that the civil rights movement had not reached.
We started as a very simple organizing tool we had a form that had housing, violations on it, and we'd ask people, we just check off the list and then send it to the housing department. There was one particular landlord who had 2 buildings on Peshine Avenue that were just completely awful. To describe them is to describe complete deterioration, complete lack of care. What a house would look like if nothing was done to it for 20 years and people lived in it. Broken doors, broken everything, garbage, things didn't work, leaks, holes in the walls. Needless to say, roaches, rats, vermin of all sorts. We demonstrated once at the house of the landlord from Peshine Avenue. We sort of took our protest to the suburbs where he lived. And the landlord just did nothing.
NCUP, they were never effective as anarchists anyway. Let me set the stage for that period. In Newark at that time, there were practically no black anything. There were no black bus drivers. There were few black policemen. There were no black clerks in the department stores, no black tellers in the banks. If you visited New Jersey Bell Telephone, all the representatives were white. So in a period between 63 and 64, we sort of got motivated by what was happening in the South. Mayor Addonizio, he was beholden to the status quo. That was the status quo that were unions. Some of them were controlled by organized crime that were not interested in hiring blacks. And the construction companies that were controlled by organized crime, he was beholden to those people who elected him. And he had already co-opted a lot of the black ministers who were part of his administration. So we were, again, fighting the white power structure. So it was them against us, in a sense. And we had no power. So he didn't have to listen to us. And at one time, the mayor announced they were going to build a major high school in Newark. And everybody said, hey, great, jobs. But it didn't turn out that way. There were lots of people working, but no blacks on the job. So a coalition of civil rights groups, including CORE, barricaded Barringer High School to stop the job. There was a confrontation with the police and construction workers, getting dragged through the mud and hit in the face. And after some meetings, we decided a better strategy would be to take the demonstrations downtown. But the minute we mentioned downtown, the business community became very active. It created the fear of God in the business community to see traffic being stopped downtown, and people seeing that on television would prevent suburban people from coming downtown to shop at Bamberger's, to go to the banks. It would disrupt the commerce of Newark. And at one point, we formed what was called a Business and Industrial Coordinating Council. And on that council were the major business leaders of the city, the president of Bell Telephone, the president of Macy's, the president of Public Service. They committed to something like 3,000 jobs. For the first time, you saw black salespeople, black tellers in banks. If you visited New Jersey Bell Telephone, there were black representatives behind the counters. In other words, they saw the community for the first time as a political force.
Another issue in the summer of 1967 was the appointment of a new secretary of the Board of Education.
And everyone said, well, okay, here's an opportunity to show that you will include the majority of people. And the African-American community recommended Wilbur Parker, CPA, credentials, 3-page, a great resume. That's the man we want. We're going to give you a CPA. Who better to sit on our Board of Education than a CPA?
And Atenizio chose a white man of demonstrably inferior credentials.
A non-African American who couldn't even qualify, who didn't have the credentials, who didn't have the resume of a Wilbur Parker. If a Wilbur Parker wasn't qualified, what chance do we have? Average Joe citizen.
They wanted to run a kind of urban renewal on the black community in Central Ward.
We must look at this within the context of the 1960s, where many historic black communities and some historic white ethnic communities were being bulldozed to make way for big capital projects such as highways.
There were highways that were coming through. There was 280 that was being built. There was 78. And then right in the middle of the city, there was a proposed link. Now, in the way of this, that's where people lived. That's where there were stores, there were businesses, there were things that that community relied on. Those were taken away. And it just tore up families.
The other major incident was the decision by the Atenizio administration to bring a state medical school to Newark.
New Jersey College of Medicine and Dentistry had by the summer of 1967 been promised a very large site, kind of in the Central Ward of Newark.
So when they announced they were going to take 150 acres, people began to recognize what 150 acres meant.
We did the research, of course, and found out the largest medical school in the world was on a half an acre, which was, of course, Johns Hopkins.
Atenizio was prepared to essentially use eminent domain and condemn a large tract of housing in the Central Ward, reminding blacks of what powerful white interests had always done, and that's to ignore the history of black communities and the presence of blacks.
Why they needed all that land or why they needed to have a campus. Why did they have to build a medical school in Newark? Obviously they didn't.
Atenizio and them saw it in terms of jobs for their friends, and they were not considering at all what the black community would think about this.
This proposal has been rammed down the throat of the Negro community, whose homes are going to be razed, and we must not permit this kind of careless attitude to exist in New Jersey or in the city of Newark.
And they were angry about that. They saw themselves being overrun. They saw themselves being bullied. It was the institutional counterpart of police brutality.
They've come from Georgia or North Carolina or Virginia, hoping to find a better life. And then all of a sudden, it seems to be the same old story. When it comes time to do something and somebody has to pay for it in terms of the disruption of their life, well, let's let it be black Americans.
We're still the last hired in the first fire. We were still disproportionate number on welfare. We were still disproportionately being arrested. So no longer did the rhetoric work that just wait.
But it's interesting that in American history, sometimes your greatest frustration can come when you expect things to be getting better, and yet the pace is agonizingly slow. And we have one life to lead, and so it's not very satisfying to know that, well, things are going to be better, and in 50 years from now, it'll be all right. Well, it's my one time around.
Now we got some rich colored men in office, but you know how they got up there? They was whitewashed by a rich white man.
Hostile meetings, heated meetings, shouting.
Spearheaded it. Don't tell us about 300 people. We see what they did down there.
Screaming, pushing. This is our meeting.
I myself and get what I want. I don't need no 5 people.
The utter frustration that people have because of a hostile, brutal, and a non-responding government that ignored them and did not recognize their legitimate needs for the basics of life: food, clothing, shelter, water, recreation, social service, health care, all denied a majority of people, created this powder keg ready to explode. And if not a cab driver and John Smith, it could have been bumping into someone. It could have been any other incident that could have ignited, triggered the 1967 rebellion or the 1967 riots, depending on your frame of mind.
The Soul Brother destruction was done by the police. It was not done by people who lived in the community.
These black businessmen put signs in their windows saying, Soul Brother, or black-owned business, and hadn't been touched for the most part by rioters. It was state police and troopers.
And it seemed to be a vengeance pattern by the police. All the Soul Brothers that didn't get it from the riot got it from the police towards the end.
One symbol that is most threatening to whites is the symbol of black progress.
I didn't experience any animosity with the troops that I was in touch with or in command of during this period of time.
Another thing that we found out, a lot of these people were killed as crimes of opportunity. In some cases by police who said, oh, he's a bad guy, and they took that opportunity to pick him up. The most egregious of these was a guy named Jimmy Rutledge, who I believe had been shot 23 times. And none of that made any sense. He died in police custody with a lot of bullet wounds. I don't know.
I'm not sure anybody was ever arrested, indicted, or prosecuted.
Well, the murder cases were difficult to prove. I put Andy Cesali in charge of the murder cases, and he presented each one of them before a grand jury.
Finally, after 3 or 4 days of intolerable violence and bloodshed, the peacekeeping in an urban war zone began to take place.
Well, the end came about mostly by negotiation.
Dick Hughes walking in unarmed with the state trooper into the Colonnade Apartments to meet some folks who were arguably the people who would have an influence on the neighborhoods and on the people who were engaging in some of the violence on the citizen side.
And I got a phone call representing the governor, and they wanted me to come to a meeting about the riot. It must have been 2, 3 in the morning. I had to be picked up under cover of darkness, put in the back seat of a vehicle. But they made it into, a classic military maneuver. Screaming sirens, vehicles running at 80 miles an hour so that sniper fire wouldn't take us out. And I surfaced in my kind of raggedy clothes with my notebooks, and there was about 20 people, all of whom represented different levels of police authority. And there was the governor, Richard Hughes. They wanted me and Bob Kervin to describe the situation as we saw it. And I started to understand that they were trapped. They were not the superior beings that they might seem to be on the street. They were trapped because they couldn't leave. Because if they left and something happened, they'd be blamed. I told them that I thought by this point that the troops were perpetuating the violence and that the troops had to go, and that it was my judgment that the community was exhausted and would welcome the withdrawal of the troops, and it would not be followed by a flare-up of further violence. Our advice was followed in the morning, and the troops left. And nothing did happen. It was over. They just needed to know that it was really over.
At that time, things truly were quiet. In no way, shape, or form did I see what I did see entering into the city and coming up with the feeling, my God, I'm entering into a war zone. I didn't have that feeling leaving Newark. I think we left it in capable hands, being the capable hands of the local police, as well as New Jersey State Police. I can't tell you what a relief that happened to be. You don't realize the stress and strain on you personally or on your men until it's all over with. In fact, in many cases, the men just simply walked out of the army and cried. And just cried.
But by now, 20 or 30 people were dead. Hundreds were injured. Over 1,000 were detained in the jail without charges or bail. The damage was done. The troops were withdrawn, but there was no real sense that there was an intervention to finally solve any of the problems that had triggered this. I was left with the feeling that things would now be worse.
There was an enormous change in the atmosphere in the neighborhood, literally overnight. There was a level of, well, I'll tell you a very specific example. Betty Moss, who was a neighborhood person who worked with us, had gone to Mississippi to visit SNCC, and Betty had come back with an afro. Well, the day after the riots, once people were out in the street again and it was calm, there were afros all over the place. And there was a hostility towards the white people that I hadn't felt before. There was a level of suspicion that even we got, even having lived there all those years at that point and knowing people so well.
I don't think NCUP understood the black community when they came here. The black community were not interested in overturning the government. They were not looking to be revolutionaries or anarchists outside the system. They were looking for housing. They were looking for political power. They were looking for a piece of the pie. They were looking for a piece of America. They wanted to be a part of the system that represented them and gave them what they were looking for.
But it meant that we had to leave. The civil rights workers of the 1960 to 67 period were now history. We were out of the picture.
That's the unfortunate part of the Newarks of the world. You fight and stay, or you fight, become frustrated, and you move on.
We didn't have the power to get our way. We might have. Something might have happened, but by then it was too late. The war in Vietnam was totally underway. And what it did was it meant that siphoning of money that could have gone for rehabilitating the ghettos where people were rising up, revolting, and so on, into the destruction of Vietnam It drafted God knows how many thousands of black and brown soldiers in addition to the whites. A high percentage of them came back in body bags, came back drug addicted, came back damaged, right into the situation that they had left, having thought that maybe the Army was the way out. Because that whole generation of young men could have been the future leaders.
Some people who live in white neighborhoods may wonder how this can happen, how people can behave this way. But some of the young men around here explain it very simply. They say they ask you to go away and die for a country that isn't really yours. This, perhaps the clearest evidence to date that they don't consider it theirs.
At the time Newark happened, you remember, you had Watts in 65. You had Jersey City, people don't talk about that, Harlem, and then you had Detroit and Newark almost the same time.
There was an eerie similarity among all the events, which makes some people think there was coordination.
I don't think there was an organized force. I think they were spontaneous in the sense that each of them came out of the situation that people were in.
Well, most of it to me was spontaneous and random. That is the reaction to American oppression, to U.S. oppression. I'll say this, I don't think that's necessarily the end of those kind of, certainly with the kind of Bush pushing hard to the right, there's going to be some kind of reaction, and, it could take the same form, it could be better organized, it could take other forms.
The 60s are studied selectively, but the 500 urban rebellions are left out. Like, that's not the 60s. As if somebody learned about it, they might take away dangerous lessons. Or worse, it's not even history, which means the poor remain in oblivion. They tried to riot against being oblivious, and we've returned them to oblivion. But it was an amazing time that deserves more attention. The only attention I remember were very good lawyers and investigators for the Kerner Commission that President Johnson ordered. They concluded that the riots arose in response to neglect, long-standing grievances, official indifference, that the solutions would require jobs, but also, in addition to economic change, empowerment was emphasized. And of course, in general, the recommendations of the Kerner Commission simply weren't followed.
And I think if anything we get out of that Kerner Commission, that whole study, is that we in a leadership position should not allow conditions to become so bad, levels of frustration so high, that people feel hopelessness is a hue and cry, and they would rather riot and risk their lives than come to a table and talk about reform, talk about progress.
There was something interesting going on at that time. There was a Black Power conference going on in Newark that summer.
We're pleased that all of you, ladies and gentlemen of the press, are here.
And I think that was the first time I heard it called a rebellion and not a riot. It spoke some truth about what was going on. It spoke some truth about what, not the whole truth about what was going on, but some truth.
I think the biggest thrust after all that happened, the tragedies, the smokes and the burning, the looting, the killings, and the unexplained death of so many innocent people, we vowed then that the only way out, the only way up, was to gain political power. Stop marching, stop talking, go out and get some political power.
And in 3 years, in 1970, we elected Ken Gibson, the first black mayor. We thought, if we got rid of the white people, everything would be cool.
You say, I know what's wrong with Newark. We just have to get rid of Whitey. If we get rid of Whitey and put our people in, we'll be all right. It took many years thereafter to learn that it was never just a question of from white to black. You have to evaluate those who serve in elected positions, see if, in fact, They are about the community. They are about bringing about change that will benefit the entire city and not just themselves.
As we rode through in the police cars, you saw nothing but for sale signs. I'd say within a matter of 6 months after the riots, most of the folks who lived in the Weequahic section were gone. And then when the houses couldn't be sold as quickly as people would like, you began to see abandonment. You began to see people board up their windows and stuff, and just leave.
The white exodus from the so-called, quote, white neighborhoods of Newark, places like Vailsburg, Weequahic, and things like this, they were already leaving. There's no question that the riots, accelerated a little bit, but the groups were already leaving.
And people had good reason to leave. They were right, because in their heart, they were not happy here. The crime and the schools were the biggest reasons. And also the racism. They didn't like, a lot of people couldn't accept that black people would be the chief of police or the judge or the mayor and whatever.
Springfield Avenue, one of the most important thoroughfares in Newark. For at least 3 decades, it goes into decline. By the late 1970s and 1980s, there's not a movie theater in Newark, not a grocery store in Newark, if you mean by a grocery store what most people would consider a modern supermarket. In the late 70s and 1980s, there was a big, thick book of properties for auction in Newark that had been foreclosed, abandoned. And many, many of those houses were available for $25 down on a total payment of $100. Now, that's how bad things got. To think that somehow you could take over large swatches of a city for a pittance, it tells you something about where the city had sunk. So I think after the riots, you really have a period of 30 years, maybe 35 years of despair, of lost lives. It's easy for a historian just to kind of say, 35 years. Think of all the children who grew up there without as much opportunity as they might otherwise have had.
And it was not until the 1980s that I began to see, mainly as a historian and as a resident, this slow change in Newark, where Newark became more and more a livable city, a city characterized by civic behavior, and a city that had some degree of optimism about itself.
The same conditions that existed in 1967, these conditions exist today. It's not enough to sit on the sideline and talk about how bad things are. You got to get out there and struggle to change it.
To understand what's going on in Newark today and the future trajectory for the city, you have to understand the condition of the people. The unemployment rate is 9 to 10%. Here we sit now in worse shape than we were in 1967. It's pretty safe to say that where you have high rates of unemployment and high rates of poverty, you're going to have high rates of crime.
Enough is enough. Enough is enough. We're breaking our silence. We're breaking our silence. We're taking back Newark. We're taking back Newark. So stop.
These problems are not just Newark's problems. They're urban America's problems. And really, they're not just urban America's problems. They're America's problems.
But standing here at Springfield Avenue, you're struck with one thing, the signs on the stores. Credit. Charge it. Charge everything. Easy terms. 36 months to pay, loans, pawnbrokers. These are the advertisements for the poor.
What occurred in Newark in '67 was not a singularity. If people are thinking this could never happen again, they're simply wrong.
I think without direct action in the 60s, much, much less could have been accomplished. And if getting into the street is the first step, I say get into the street.
Enough is enough. Enough is enough. Enough is enough.
To learn more about America Reframed, the stories and issues we present, visit our website at worldchannel.org. I'm Natasha Del Toro. Thanks, and see you next time.
No heart and soul insides flowing out. No fighting in the street, no fires rip the sky, no children screaming death, no police, no state, except it is the state, bull on the wall, no people struggle, just colors thrown by baby snooks, a down and leaving unintellectual, no record of this place. As wild a joint as America is, somebody should get the down, otherwise no one will believe it. Get it down, get it on the record.
Major funding for America Reframed on World is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding is provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation.